Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on the subject of ISO 14001-2015 Lessons Learned. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. Welcome. I have a brief agenda on this slide giving you an idea of what we'll be covering today. We will just briefly open up talking about PJR, what we do, some of the general benefits to certification to standards such as ISO 14001. We can go over the transition process for anyone who may not be familiar with it, but this, this far into the transition, I will just go over that very briefly. Most of the time we'll be talking about the changes to the standard and any lessons that we've learned there. And we will close the presentation with an overview of certification requirements for anyone who is pursuing certification to the standard for the first time and is not familiar with what that process entails. And we'll leave a few minutes at the end for questions. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to go ahead and type them in the questions field, and I will save those for the end. For anyone who is not familiar with our webinar process as well, just really briefly, after today's webinar, in the next day or so, you'll be able to see a link on our website for the recording of today's presentation. You can also, through our website, obtain the slides if you would like to maintain those slides for reference in the future. You can do both of those things through our website after the presentation today. So PJR is one of the leading registrars in the world. ISO 14001 is one of several standards that we are able to certify companies to. We'll talk about that in a moment. But this list of countries gives an idea of our global presence, not an all-inclusive list necessarily, but like I said, gives you an idea of where we're certifying companies and our reach. And we're accredited not just to grant certifications for ISO 14001, but a wide variety of standards as well. So if you're looking to integrate other standard management systems, we can help with that as well. Benefits of certification vary by industry and standard to a degree, but in general, certifications to management systems are the process of implementing and maintaining the standard requirements for a management system. All will produce similar benefits. So meeting legal requirements is a requirement of the standard, having that framework to identify what those requirements are and maintain operational controls to stay in compliance with those requirements, improving the organization's environmental performance, driving management commitment and employee engagement through meeting the requirements of the standard, different business management benefits, including meeting stakeholder requirements, improving public image, being able to advertise a certification such as this, kind of going above and beyond, since it's not a required standard, it's optional. That can go a long way as far as public image is concerned, achieving any strategic objectives that the organization may have or that corporate may have, and also the ability to integrate the management system for ISO 14001 with other business management systems. It can drive improvements to supplier environmental performance as well, kind of a flow down effect. Having a certification can provide a competitive advantage if you are competing against organizations without comparable credentials. And occasionally there could be financial benefits, could be related to the competitive advantage that you have earned, could be improvements to the public image and gaining additional business, could be potential discounts in insurance coverage depending on the standard certification and the insurance company. So those are just a couple examples. Obviously, for anyone who's familiar with the standard, even at a high level, ISO 14001 is an environmental standard. So the specific drivers for this standard would be a commitment to environmental protection and conservation, the reduction of any risk of adverse environmental impacts. So not just reacting to adverse environmental impacts, but trying to reduce the risk of them occurring proactively. And another driver being meeting customer requirements, improving public image, the business management drivers we discussed on the last slide. So like I said, we're beyond the transition period in this case. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. If you were an organization who was certified to the previous version of this standard, then you've likely, hopefully, completed your transition period. Otherwise, you would have had a lapse in certification. And some companies did decide not to transition, but for the most part, companies wanting to maintain their certification already transitioned. So at this point, the important takeaway is that if you're looking to get certified for the first time, or you let your certification lapse and you're looking to get recertified, the previous version of the standard, ISO 14001-2004, is no longer an option. We cannot issue certificates to that standard now that we are beyond the transition period. So we only offer certifications to ISO 14001-2015 at this time. We'll go through the standard clause by clause or chapter by chapter and look at the most significant changes and any lessons that we've learned along the way. The yellow box at the bottom will represent any lessons learned or important takeaways. So for clause 4 context, this section of the standard is addressing obviously the organization's context, what that means, how it's determined, also the scope of the management system. Companies have to give more consideration to external issues than in the previous version of the standard, and any impacts those external issues may have on the organization's environmental management system. So we're really going beyond the 4 or however many walls of the building or the organization's portion of the building to consider what external forces may also have an impact. The needs and expectations of interested parties are required to be better understood, to be considered, to be identified, and then for the organization to evaluate whether or not those requirements or those needs translate to specific requirements that would be relevant to the environmental management system. So again, going beyond maybe what we considered or stressed in the last version of the standard. So some lessons learned here. It's important for an organization to take the time to really identify the context of the organization. This is one of the building blocks for the majority of the requirements throughout the standard. You'll see the same terminology over and over again. So if you haven't taken the time to identify that before you've moved on to all the other steps and requirements in the standard, you're missing that foundation that you need in place. It's also important to clearly define your organization's interested parties as the relevant interested parties, so as relevant to the environmental management system. If you haven't identified who those interested parties are, you certainly can't identify what the needs and expectations may be. So Clearly define those interested parties internally and externally, and then you can go to the next step, which is to identify what those needs and expectations are. If they translate to requirements for your management system, then you'll need to clearly define how those needs and expectations are identified and monitored. So how are you becoming aware of them? How are you going to continue to be aware of them or be made aware of any changes that may occur, using employees and neighbors as examples, but obviously the list is quite a bit longer than that. It's also really important to be proactive in your approach. So again, identifying the context, identifying who those interested parties are, is this, we're getting these building blocks in place, we're building a framework for the rest of the standard, and the idea being reducing or eliminating the risk of environmental impact, to be proactive at this stage in identifying what these requirements may be. So we're not reacting to negative impacts, but we have already identified the potential risk proactively. Chapter 5 focuses on leadership. It requires top management, and you can look in the standard for how that term is defined. Top management needs to take on more responsibility for the effectiveness of the management system, as well as the integration of the management system into its business processes. So you'll find, compared to ISO 14001-2004, there's a much greater emphasis on management accountability and involvement. And this chapter is focused on that. The environmental policy is required to include a commitment to protect the environment beyond the corporate boundaries. So again, we're going beyond just those walls of the company itself, because the impact can go a lot further than that. And the management system can also be impacted by things going on outside of those walls. So it goes both ways, all again relating to a proactive approach to an effective identification of interested parties. So again, going beyond those boundaries will be necessary now. And this is all as is relevant. So obviously there will be instances where there is little to no impact beyond the organization's boundaries, but it needs to be considered. It needs to be identified on a case-by-case basis, because quite often there are interested parties, there are impacts beyond just what goes on within the walls of the organization. In the 2015 version of the standard, a management representative is no longer required. But again, circling back to top management and their responsibilities, adequate responsibilities need to be allocated and ensured within the organization. And the responsibility for that will ultimately fall on top management if resources are not being allocated as necessary to maintain the management system and to meet all of those responsibility needs. Leadership will be accountable for that. Again, we see the concept of proactivity. Plan and clearly define the strategic direction, of your organization is important. Again, getting these proactive building blocks in place, and ensure that the strategic direction that you've identified supports continual improvement of the environmental management system and the environmental performance of the organization. So this is pretty important, in that environmental performance is stressed. We used to focus mostly on improving the management system itself. Now we're looking more to see improvements in the environmental performance of the organization. And that's an important shift. And the tone or the strategic direction or the support from leadership should certainly be that of continual improvement. So it's not a system or a standard that we roll out We implement the requirements and we never grow, we never improve from there, because the whole point of the standard is improvement of the environmental performance. So we are going to be looking for that to come through. Senior management will also be required or need to be able to demonstrate their involvement. Again, we're looking for top management to be responsible, to be involved, and this will be evident or not evident through the course of audits. Are they taking an active role in the audits? Are they part of the opening, closing meetings? Do they know how the system is running, how effectively it's working? Are they aware of what goes into maintaining the system? Are they helping to emphasize throughout the organization the importance of following the environmental system requirements or driving that continual improvement that we were talking about earlier? You know, there's a variety of factors that we're going to be looking for to demonstrate that senior management or top management involvement and accountability. So that's something to think about. Chapter 6 focuses on planning. The planning process should include both positive and negative factors, which in this standard is termed opportunities and risks. A life cycle perspective or a life cycle approach is also important, and you can take a look at the definitions for these terms within the standard if you're not already familiar with them. These will serve or help to ensure that the management system meets its intended outcomes, also preventing undesirable environmental impacts and achieving continual improvement. So we talked about meeting its intended outcomes, and that really has to do with the environmental performance of the system. So again, take a look at the terms and definitions section of the standard to understand better the opportunities, the risks, and the life cycle perspective expectations if you're not already familiar with those, as they are new to this version of the standard. Risks and opportunities specifically may relate to environmental aspects, compliance obligations, or other issues identified in Clause 4 that we talked about earlier, which may relate to context and or the needs and expectations of interested parties. Risks and opportunities should also be considered when planning any objectives or targets that the organization is setting as well. So some lessons learned here: a formal life cycle assessment is not required. That's not exactly what we mean by life cycle perspective. So definitely take a look at that definition there. However, risk assessments should examine not just the significant environmental aspects, but also applicable requirements. So again, we're talking legal or compliance requirements, interested party needs or issues, risks or opportunities, things like that. Be proactive in your approach. I feel like a little bit of a broken record, but in these revised standards such as ISO 14001, proactivity is really stressed. They're raising the bar for the expectations, and the whole point is to identify where the risks can be found in order to prevent those environmental impacts, prevent those spills or pollution emissions, releases of any kind, things like that. We are supposed to be proactive in our approach, and the language and the tone of this standard really serves that concept better. So be proactive in your approach, think beyond the walls of your building or your organization's portion of the building, and this includes preventive action requirements. Specific language requiring preventive actions or using that term has been removed from the 2015 standard. However, the requirement for preventive actions is not gone. It can be found without that specific term in a couple different clauses in the standard, because the idea here is still continual improvement and preventive actions are an important way to that end, an important way to drive continual improvement or capture those improvement opportunities. Chapter 7 relates to support. Communication is stressed. Commitments to environmental protection are to be given more consideration in terms of communication. External reporting or any communication externally must be regulated. In some cases, this relates to a requirement to report certain environmental data or environmental releases in certain scenarios, and that needs to be controlled. Documents and records have been replaced with the terminology documented information. This is another term you can check out in the definition section of the standard. This term is meant to be broader and give organizations more flexibility in what type of media they utilize in this modern age for maintaining those what used to be called documents or records, basically the evidence of meeting the requirements of the standard. You can still do things the same way you used to, it just the standard has grown and the terminology has changed for those companies that didn't find, paper records or all the documents being maintained in a certain way to be working for them. So some lessons learned here. Any insufficient resources identified in this support section ultimately relate to the leadership requirements of Clause 5 or speak to a deficit in the leadership, the meeting of the leadership requirements identified in Clause 5. Just because we're not using the term records necessarily, we do still need to be able to see evidence of meeting the requirements of the standard. So whatever that may look like specifically to your organization, the requirements to provide evidence of meeting these requirements is not going away. So one example of that would be meeting competency needs. When you've identified competency requirements for employees or certain roles within the organization, you're going to need to be able to show evidence that the people in those roles, the personnel in those roles, are meeting those competency needs. It's important to make sure workers are aware of their role in the organization's environmental performance, which can vary by significance depending on their specific role, their job, their tasks, their impact on the environmental performance is not necessarily the same as every other job title in the organization. So that's something to think about as well. And it's also important that workers are aware of the implications of not conforming with the requirements of the environmental management system. So if they are deviating from their procedures, if they're deviating from the identified operational controls, they need to understand the implications of that. They could be violating a compliance regulation and placing the organization in a status of violation of those requirements, for example, and the implications that that can have. So some of these operational controls or some of these requirements for the organization may be coming from these legal and other compliance requirements, and it's important for employees to understand where these requirements are coming from and what can happen if they are not conforming to those requirements. Something I like to remind people is that awareness, the requirements in the awareness subclause of Chapter 7 do not equate to memorization. So the standard outlines certain topics or certain concepts that employees are to be aware of. That does not mean that they need to be able to regurgitate all of that information verbatim to an auditor. Chapter 8 relates to operations. Scheduling and control can include environmental impacts of products or processes upstream, downstream, outsourced processes, all the way through utilization and disposal. So it really depends on the specific organization, the specific industry, how much they are outsourcing or what types of raw materials or chemicals they are getting from a supplier, what they are shipping out. This really varies by industry and organization, like I said, but keep in mind, again, we're going beyond the walls of the organization to think bigger than that. Each stage of the product or service process's life cycle is to be considered. And again, we can circle back to the definitions here, look at what that life cycle perspective means. We're talking cradle to grave here, to be considered. In some instances, an organization is going to have zero potential for impact on some of those areas, but usually there is at least some potential impact, even just in who an organization chooses to utilize, who their suppliers are, who are they working with, who are their upstreams, who are their downstreams, who are they using for their disposal, what type of packaging material are they purchasing, and though sometimes it can be cumbersome to find alternatives, some of those areas are within the organization's control, at least to an extent. So again, be proactive in your approach. That's the expectation. Don't forget concepts such as design and development, procurement, supplier performance, delivery methods, packaging, recyclability of the product itself or of the packaging, how the product is disposed of, or the end-of-life treatment options. Very industry specific. However, just a reminder again that is cradle to grave, to be considered at least. Also a reminder not to overlook off shifts, especially in the areas of emergency response planning and testing of those response protocols. So for example, your fire drills, your emergency drills, we're not just talking, day shift here. There can be unique factors related to night shift that can be overlooked if you're not testing those processes. Are the outdoor lights, in the parking lot or by steps or in stairwells working? And if you're just focusing on the day shift with the daylight, you're not going to recognize those issues. In the winter months, are we having snow cleanup and ice removal effective or timely on the off shifts as well, that would pose a hazard? Or what is happening to the, trying to think of environmental examples, the salt used to melt the ice in the parking lot, is that being applied in a different way on the off shifts and hasn't been captured? Things like that. Chapter 9 focuses on performance evaluations. So there are additional environmental assessment requirements and expectations in this section of the standard. So I mentioned earlier, the bar is being raised here with the revised standard, the proactivity expectations, and that goes hand in hand with increased expectations for environmental performance. The lessons learned here, or at least the first one, really relates to the transition period, which has already closed. It was a reminder to make sure before your transition audit that you've had an internal audit and a management review to the revised standards. So that one's kind of a moot point at this point. But it is important to remember that the evaluation of compliance goes beyond just a list of what those requirements are. So we're looking for evidence of conformance to those requirements. Sometimes sampling is perfectly acceptable, but if you are making a determination of whether you're in compliance with the applicable legal and other requirements, and it's not just a list that we're looking for here, how did you verify compliance? Were records sampled? Were employees interviewed? Were there observations made? What evidence was used to say, yes, we're in compliance with the specific regulations or requirements that were covered during that evaluation? Chapter 10 covers improvement requirements. Obviously, any nonconformities are expected to be corrected, and the continual improvement process is still very much a part of the standard, focusing more on the organization's surroundings and the improvement of environmental performance. So we've really already talked about these things, right? We're going beyond the walls of the organization, thinking about the other areas that the organization may have an impact or be impacted by, and the emphasis of improvement being on the environmental performance itself versus just the improvement of the management system. One more time, in case you missed it throughout the rest of the webinar, be proactive in your approach. We already touched on preventive action requirements, which are still implied in several sections of the organization, the standard, including in clause 10, even though the terminology or the specific term preventive action is removed from the 2015 standard. It's important that the corrective action process is clearly defined. Not only does this help standardize the process for the organization and have it be implemented consistently across the board, it also helps auditors be able to assess the effectiveness of that process if the expectations are clearly defined. Otherwise, we see instances in some cases of certain things being captured as corrective actions, and then a very similar instance was not recorded because the expectations for corrective actions are kind of vague or left to the subjectivity of the various personnel who may be allowed to submit corrective actions or investigate incidents. You want that process to be really clearly defined so it can be implemented consistently and effectively. So that's an overview of this, the changes and the lessons learned. So as I mentioned, we'll just briefly summarize the steps for certification for anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time, and then we will get to any questions that you guys have. So the first step in pursuing certification would be to establish the documentation requirements for the ISO 14001 standard, conduct any training needed to meet the requirements of ISO 14001, implement the 14001 requirements, including internal audit, compliance evaluation, and management review, which would take place after those audits to be able to have the results of the audits serve as an input to the management review, something to be discussed and reviewed during that meeting or that process. You would also need to contract with a certification body such as PJR. And then, as we'll discuss further on the next slide, you'd be completing audits to result in your certification. Those audits specifically are a stage 1 and a stage 2 audit. The stage 1 audit is a documentation review of the management system to make sure the framework is in place. The requirements of your standard have been identified and the framework is there, and that you are ready to proceed to stage 2. Stage 2 is an audit of the entire management system, sampling all of the processes, all the shifts, to assess whether or not the framework, the processes identified or reviewed during the Stage 1 have been effectively implemented and are serving to meet the requirements of the standard. Any nonconformities that result from the Stage 2 will need to be resolved before a certificate can be issued. Once a company is certified, you will enter the surveillance cycle, which is good. The certificate is good for 3 years. So you've got 2 years of surveillance audits, which may be annual or semi-annual, depending on the contract and the client. And those would be partial system audits. So unlike the Stage 2, where we audit all the processes, we would be sampling some of the processes at these surveillance audits. They would be a little shorter, theoretically, and not cover necessarily all the shifts or all the processes. On the 3rd year of the cycle, we'd have a recertification audit, which is essentially the same as a Stage 2 audit. We cover all of the processes, all the shifts, and a new certificate would be issued after any nonconformities are resolved. Good for another 3 years. The cycle starts over. Okay, so if you haven't already gotten a chance, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type those in now. I'm going to put the last slide up on the screen for everyone to see so that our contact information is clearly visible. So again, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR, and you can find my email address on the screen here. If you have any follow-up questions or you want to talk in more detail about a specific scenario you may be encountering, Stacy DeSantis is our EHS Program Manager. She can also be contacted with any technical questions in addition to myself. And if you are currently looking for a certification body or interested in getting a quote for ISO 14001 or any other standards that we're accredited to, you can go ahead and contact our sales department through the phone number listed on the screen here. Okay, let's see if we have any questions. Okay, so the first question is whether the added expense of a Stage 1 audit is required or if a client can go straight to a Stage 2 audit. So the short answer is yes, it is required. However, there might be some other options. The audit time calculations that we are required to follow include both a Stage 1 and Stage 2. So sometimes there's some flexibility in how that time is allotted. If more time can be added to the Stage 2 and the Stage 1 shortened. As a rule, we don't generally do offsite Stage 1 audits, but occasionally that is possible. Sometimes we are also in a pinch able to schedule the Stage 1 and Stage 2 audits pretty close together. However, it's not a common practice and it's not necessarily recommended. If you have any concerns identified in Stage 1, you may not have much time to address them before the Stage 2. Then we run into issues where if the client is really not ready for their Stage 2 and all the travel has been booked, there's a lot of expenses to make those changes to the travel arrangements. By then the auditor's schedule may be full and the audit may be really difficult to reschedule. So there, just off the top of my head, there would be a lot of concerns there, but in general, yes, a Stage 1 is required to be sure that we're not proceeding right to Stage 2. Again, all the travel, the longer audit, if the client, in fact, is not ready to do so. I hope that answers your question. Okay, we have another question about the context. Can you describe what is needed to show we have identified the context of the organization? Is this a description of processes and showing what is included in the EMS? So without necessarily closing out of the presentation to open up the standard, I would say that this could be shown, the evidence for the context could be exemplified in a variety of ways. A description of processes is part of the requirement of the standard, absolutely. Showing what is included in the EMS. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that particular phrase, but the context, it goes sort of hand in hand or is similar to the identification of the scope. So once you've identified the scope, you are documenting that within your manual if you have one, or your website. Some companies will relay their scope via their website so that other organizations know what they do. That really varies by company. So if you're documenting your scope in the manual, for example, if you have a manual, I would expect the context to also be documented accordingly. It's really hard to answer. This would be different for each organization, I think, the way that they would go forward and implement that or show that they've identified that. Certainly it's documented in a manual often, but not everyone is using a manual anymore given the changes to the document and records definitions, the shift to documented information. A manual isn't explicitly required anymore. So this really varies quite a bit. We can talk more offline if you've got some specific ideas or specific questions. I can't consult, but I can certainly look at the standard more closely with you and have a chat about that. Okay. I don't see any other questions at this time. So unless one pops up in the next minute, we will go ahead and sign off. So thank you for joining us today. Like I said, these slides will be made available after the presentation for reference, and my contact information is on the screen if you have any further questions. Good luck with your audit or your transition, your audit if you're pursuing certification for the first time. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for joining us today and have a great day.